Hello everyone! We are going to start the semester with Chapter 1, Humans in the World of Biology. We will be covering all of the sections in this chapter, so the basic characteristics of all living things, evolution a unifying theme in biology, levels of biological organization, the scientific method, and critical thinking to evaluate scientific claims. But we're going to start off with the basic characteristics of all living things. And to start off, all living things contain the molecules of life. And what we mean by that is everything on this earth is made up of an assembly of about 100 different elements. So whether we're talking about living or non-living things, the earth's crusts, rocks, soil, mineral, plants, funguses, human brain matter, it's all made up of about the same 100 different elements. However, one thing that differentiates living from non-living material is that living material or living organisms are made up of these four basic macromolecules. And that would be nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. So everything that is alive, whether we're talking about basic protozoa, bacteria, funguses, plants, again, human brains, everything is going to be composed of these four macromolecules. And we're actually going to spend a lot of time in Chapter 2 going over these four groups, so we're simply going to mention them now. Next is that all living things are going to be composed of cells. Cells are the smallest units of life. So whether we're talking about single-celled organisms or large, complex, multicellular organisms, everything that is alive is composed at its basic unit of cells. Organisms that are made up of only one cell are called unicellular. Organisms that are made up of multiple cells are called multicellular. So here's just a discussion question to throw out there for you or to mark down in your notes. As human beings, are we unicellular organisms or multicellular organisms? That would be a great question for you to answer in our discussion groups or to add onto our discussion board. So all organisms are made up of cells, and all cells arise from pre-existing cells. The only way we can get more cells is if they start off or come from pre-existing cells. And the ability for cells to form new cells is what makes production, growth, or reproduction all possible. And so along with that, if all living things are composed of cells and cells come from cells, then all living things must grow and must be capable of reproduction. And reproduction can be either sexual or asexual, meaning that some organisms, specifically unicellular organisms, can reproduce asexually or by cloning themselves. They'll essentially make a copy of their own genetic information, their DNA, and then split themselves in half. And then where we once had one cell, we now have two identical cells. This is what's known as asexual reproduction. Other organisms, on the other hand, will reproduce by combining genetic information with another individual in order to reproduce. So throwing this out there, are human beings sexual or asexual living organisms? Do we reproduce by cloning our own DNA, or do we have to reproduce with the aid of another individual? And another thing I would like you to discuss or consider as you are listening to this slide or reading through this section of your textbook is, what are the benefits of each? Why do some organisms reproduce asexually? What are the pros and cons of asexual reproduction? And why do some organisms reproduce sexually? What are the pros and cons of sexual reproduction? Both of these methods have arisen, and so there must be benefits to each. There's also likely drawbacks to each. So I would like you to consider that. That may be a good question, a study question or an essay question at a later time, but it would also just be a great discussion question to think about as you are moving through these chapters. So another characteristic of all living things is that living things use energy and raw materials to carry out metabolism. Now, what do you think of when you hear that term metabolism? And I'm going to pause here for dramatic effect so that way you can think about it, you can consider. Take some time to write down, pause the video, and write down, what do you think metabolism is? Because in our understanding today, we tend to use the word metabolism a lot, especially when we're talking about diet or health or nutrition. We tend to talk about individuals who have a very fast metabolism and individuals who have a very slow metabolism. And a lot of times we think about metabolism just in terms of how do we turn raw materials into energy? Or how do we convert our food into physical activity? But metabolism is so much bigger than that. Metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions that occur in the cells. So everything from breaking down glucose and turning it into ATP to reassembling nucleic acids into long strands of DNA, to carrying hormone signals from the brain down to the various organs throughout your body. All of these are chemical reactions that occur in the body, or chemical reactions that occur in the cell. These are all part of that sum total of metabolism. And metabolism is necessary for us to be able to maintain life and allow organisms to grow. So another characteristic of all living things is that all living things are able to respond to their environment. All living things. I mean, not just animals, but plants as well. Also, bacteria, funguses, all living things must be able to respond to their environment. So just an example, plants. Plants can respond to their environment by turning to face the sunlight. If you've ever seen a field of sunflowers, you may have noticed that early in the morning, all of the heads of the sunflowers are turned to face east. Throughout the day, they'll track the sunshine and actually follow it to the west. If you don't believe me, YouTube some videos of flowers opening towards the sun or turning towards the sun in order to respond to their environment. Conversely, plants will also respond to changes in weather patterns by closing up, closing down, turning and facing heads down during rainstorms or when the sun isn't out. So another thought question or discussion question maybe is, why do plants respond that way? Why do they change their behavior based on weather patterns? What sort of benefit does this provide? And what is it that they're trying to accomplish? So along with being able to respond to the environment, we also, or as living things, all living things must be able to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is the term we use to define the relatively stable and self-maintaining internal environment of an organism. In other words, your body temperature likes to be within a very specific range. Life is very picky. Most living organisms have a very rigid set of conditions under which they can thrive. And since the outward environment can be so temperamental, it's essential that we have some self-regulating methods by which we can maintain a constant internal environment. So for example, what is, and I'm going to let you fill this in yourself, but what is the average body temperature for human beings? Now, how does that compare to our external environment? Is it warmer than that outside? Is it colder than that outside? How constant is our external environment? Because keep in mind, we don't have the ability to change our environment. If we go outside and it's too hot, there's nothing we can do about that. We can't make our external environment colder. So what we have to do is regulate our internal environment. So that way we can prevent ourselves from overheating in this miserable summer weather. We also have to have mechanisms to prevent us from freezing if the external environment gets too cold or changes too drastically. So think about that. Give me some examples. What are some things that we can do to maintain a constant internal environment? What do our bodies do when we get too hot? How do we help maintain an internal environment? What do our bodies do when we get too cold? How do we help maintain that constant internal environment? And it's not just about temperature. There are other things that we self-regulate. So for example, we have to maintain a constant pH of our blood. And so we have buffers in our bloodstream that help us prevent our blood from becoming either too acidic or too basic. And so we're going to talk about some of those mechanisms a little bit later on. But I just want to mention that homeostasis goes beyond just maintaining constant internal temperature. There are other sort of factors to maintain. Another characteristic of life is that organisms have adaptive traits that allow them to survive and reproduce. So this goes beyond just maintaining our internal environment. This goes beyond homeostasis. This goes beyond responding to our environment. What we mean by adaptive traits are traits that are going to be passed down from one generation to the next, that are going to allow that organism to survive and adapt to its environment. So members of an organism population that have beneficial traits are going to survive and have more reproductive success than the members of the population who don't. And because of this, we're going to see that over time, a population is going to change. It's going to evolve because some traits that are favorable are going to be passed on, while some unfavorable traits are not going to be passed on. This whole process is what we call evolution, or the ability to evolve. And this specific process that we're talking about, where some traits are adaptive, some traits are going to be passed down from one generation to the next based on the suitability to the environment, is what we call natural selection. And so just as an example of what this might look like in the environment of a rainforest. The climate of the rainforest is going to be hot, rainy summers and warm, wet winters. What this means is an extremely long growing season. Lots and lots of sunshine, lots and lots of rain, everything these plants need in order to, or lots of opportunity to grow. Now, because of this, there's going to be a lot of vegetation because the climate is perfect for vegetation, right? But because we have a lot of vegetation, what is that one thing that vegetation needs or plants need in order to grow and survive? They need sunlight. So when we have lots of vegetation, we're going to have a lot of competition for limited resources like sunlight. Now we have an abundance of sunlight coming down, but we have lots of vegetation growing up. And what we're going to find is that trees that are taller, or vegetation that is taller, is going to be able to surpass the rest, spread out their branches, and gather up all of the solar energy. So what we're going to see is an adaptation for very tall trees. The taller the tree, the more sunlight you can have. The more sunlight you have, the more you can grow, the more you can pass on your seeds. And if very tall trees are going to pass on very tall traits to their very tall offspring. So that way, over time, after many, many, many generations, we're going to find that in the rainforest, almost all of the trees are going to be very tall, because that's the adaptation that is best for that environment. Now, because of that, because all of the trees are very tall, that means all of the vegetation is very tall. Because of all of the vegetation is very tall, what should we expect from our herbivores? Our herbivores are going to be our animals that eat the vegetation. What we're going to find is that because all of the vegetation is tall, we're going to find that all of the herbivores have to either be tall, I guess, or they're going to have to be flying or tree-based. So we're going to see lots of insects. There are whole colonies of ants that will spend their entire life, the entire lifetime of the colony, in that tree. They'll never leave that tree. There are fruit bats, there are birds, there are frogs. There are frogs that will spend their whole life in a tree. There are lots of organisms that are going to be found up in the treetops, up where the vegetation is plentiful. So we're going to see a lot of flying or a lot of tree-based herbivores. Now, because all of our herbivores are up there, where are our carnivores going to be? Our carnivores are going to have adaptations that allow them to be in the trees. So we're going to see a lot of things like monkeys, carnivorous monkeys that are able to climb, get high in the trees. They're able to hunt down small insects or birds. We're going to see large cats, predators that can spend a lot of time in the tree, can easily climb trees in order to get at their herbivores that they want to eat. So we're going to see a lot of these adaptations. And it's very interesting to compare the rainforest to something like grasslands. And we'll talk about this in later chapters. But what we're going to find is for every sort of climate found on Earth, we're going to see specific adaptations of not just the producer base or not just the vegetation. That vegetation is going to determine what sort of herbivores are found there and what sort of carnivores are found there. And all of this is going to be based on adapting to the suitability of the environment. So that's going to be our adaptation, or how organisms and populations are able to adapt to certain environments over a period of time.